We heard from the Minister of DRC. What's wrong with your country? Well, we don't even start by saying the King of Belgium created a slave colony for 30 years. The government of Belgium ran the slave colony for another 40 years. The CIA assassinated your first popular leader, Mr. Lumumba, and then installed another dictatorship for the next 30 years.
It's called a regime change operation. There have been about 100 of them by the United States, many in your countries, and many all over the world. That's what the CIA does for a living.
Let me tell you, you don't have the cards. With us, you have the cards.
They come to office with ideas, but then soon enough, the men in dark suits and blue ties show up and tell them the way the world really is.
In America, if you don't like the other side, you don't negotiate with them, you try to overthrow them.
As the legacy media continues to try to persuade us on how we should think about Trump, Putin, Europe, Zelensky, UK, it is important for us to keep in mind that what we see on the news is likely smoke and mirrors, obscuring the true interests of one group or another. In this video, we're going to analyze the words of Jeffrey Sachs, an international economist who has advised countries all over the world on economic development. We're going to take an African perspective, understanding how we should view the actions of the West for the betterment of the continent. If you like the sound of that, stay tuned. For those of you that don't know, my name is TJ. I'm Nigerian and British mixed. I moved to Uganda about 2 years ago to start a new life with my partner Medina. And in that time, I started this channel in order to document my journey. And over time, it's evolved to talk about the issues that concern me as a person that has one foot in the West and one foot in Africa. So through this experience, I keep learning more and more about the relationship between Africa and the West. And I find out more about the history of what's going on. And I try to use that to analyze the future, because my interest is in the betterment of Africa and the betterment of people on the globe in general. So when I see Trump, Zelensky arguing in the Oval Office, when I see the insincerity of politicians and the legacy media, I feel as though it's a good thing to bring awareness on how Africa can keep its eyes open so that the horrors of the past and the manipulations that happen to Africa from the West don't happen in the future. So every so often, I keep coming across this guy, Jeffrey Sachs. He talks about what happens behind the scenes in geopolitics, and he gives talks and advice all over the world, including advice to Africa on how the continent can reach its full potential. Now, in light of the huge public disagreement that President Trump, President Zelensky and JD Vance had in front of the media in the Oval Office, the media, of course, went crazy, immediately asking the public to pick a side. Are you on Zelensky's side? Are you on Trump's side? But listen to the way Sachs discusses the Russia-Ukraine situation. And I think it's really important to understand this so that when it's Africa's turn to make deals, to interact with the West, we understand exactly how they function.
As you know, Viktor Yanukovych was elected in 2010 on the platform of neutrality. Russia had no territorial interests or designs in Ukraine at all. I know, I was there during these years. What Russia was negotiating was a 25-year lease to 2042 for Sevastopol Naval Base. That's it. Not for Crimea, not for the Donbass, nothing like that. This idea that Putin is reconstructing the Russian Empire, this is childish propaganda. Excuse me. If anyone knows the day-to-day and year-to-year history, this is childish stuff. Childish stuff seems to work better than adult stuff. So, no designs at all. The United States decided this man must be overthrown. It's called a regime change operation. There have been about 100 of them by the United States, many in your countries, and many all over the world. That's what the CIA does for a living. Okay? Please know it. It's a very unusual kind of foreign policy. But in America, if you don't like the other side, you don't negotiate with them, you try to overthrow them. Preferably covertly. If it doesn't work covertly, you do it overtly. You always say it's not our fault. They're the aggressor. They're the other side. They're Hitler. That comes up every 2 or 3 years. Whether it's Saddam Hussein, whether it's Assad, whether it's Putin, that's very convenient. That's the only foreign policy explanation the American people are ever given anywhere. Well, we're facing Munich 1938. Well, we're facing Munich 1938. Can't talk to the other side. They're evil, implacable foes. That's the only model of foreign policy we ever hear from our mass media. And the mass media repeats it entirely because it's completely suborned by the US government.
So the first thing is, whenever you're dealing with the West, you're dealing with a dangerous creature. It doesn't mean that there can't be mutual beneficial agreements. It doesn't mean that everything they do is going to be evil. But history tells us, and what this gentleman is telling us, is that they serve their own interests. They're not there to be friends. They're just there to further their own interests. So when you play the game from that perspective, you've got more of a chance of a better outcome. We all know the situation. There's an aggressor, which is Russia. And the people attacked, which is Ukraine. I think we all were right to have helped Ukraine. These are the words of Macron, the leader of the French. He's telling us who has the right, maybe the moral right, to go after Russia, to help Ukraine, because Russia are clearly in the wrong, being the aggressor. Now, this is the narrative that is being told to everyone in the UK, everyone all over Europe, and a lot of people all over the world, that Russia is the aggressor. To talk about having the right to do something contradicts Macron's own actions and the actions of the French within the African continent. In my last video, I spoke about Ibrahim Traoré and the 18 assassination attempts on his life. And this is because the actions he's taking actively go against the continuation of colonization pact that the French African countries signed with France that keeps them in debt and financial bondage. They're talking about one country meddling in another country's affairs, while themselves meddle in the affairs of 14 African nations. How much should we take from what is publicly said by these guys? Rather, we should look at their actions.
We have a world food system. It's based on large multinational companies. It's based on private profits. It's based on a very, very low measure of international transfers to help poor people, sometimes none at all. It's based on extreme irresponsibility of powerful countries with regard to the environment. And it's based on a radical denial of rights of poor people, as we just heard. It's interesting, we heard from the minister of DRC, what's wrong with your country? Well, we don't even start by saying the King of Belgium created a slave colony for 30 years. The government of Belgium ran the slave colony for another 40 years. The CIA assassinated your first popular leader, Mr. Lumumba, and then installed another dictatorship for the next 30 years. And then Glencore and others now suck out your cobalt without giving you tax income. We don't reflect on that. We say, what's wrong with you? Why don't you govern properly? And so we have a system. But we need a different system. We cannot turn this over to the private sector. We already did about 100 years ago. Not only to the private sector with the U.S. military behind it, with the defense of these property rights in the minister of Honduras's country, where United Fruit ran the country for a long time. And their attorney was the foreign minister of the United States, Secretary Dulles, and his brother was the head of the CIA and overthrew the next door neighbor, Mr. Arbenz, to make sure that United Fruit could have its property. So we have a system, but we need a different system. And the different system has to be based on principles of human dignity in the Universal Declaration, principles of sovereignty, principles of economic rights, because these are not nice things to do. In 1948, all the government said that food is a right, social protection is a right, not a nice thing, not a pleasant thing, a right. That was 73 years ago. The SDGs are nothing more than our generation's attempt to honor the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I come from a country that not only doesn't care about the world's poor, it doesn't even care about its own poor. 1 in 7 Americans is hungry right now. And they don't care. I mean, the poor people care, but one political party, all it cares about is cutting taxes for the rich and filibustering any solution. So we're in a world that's really tough. The private sector is not going to solve this problem. I'm sorry to say to all of the private sector leaders, behave, pay your taxes, follow the rules. That's what you should do.
So here we have Sachs also talking about the rights to self-sovereignty, the rights to food and dignity for the underdog. The difference is when he talks about it from a place of actual dignity, as opposed to Macron, of whom I argue is being disingenuous. So it's all very well me complaining about these leaders, but at the end of the day, they're acting in their own self-interest. What are the solutions? What can we do to turn this around for Africa? Well, Sachs has some ideas on this.
And what the governments should do is the following. They won't, but they should. First, the G20 should become the G21 by inviting systemically the chairperson of the African Union and the African Union to be the 21st country. The European Union is a member of the G20 as the EU. If you add the AU as the 21st for the G21, you add 1.4 billion people to representation at that crucial event. That will change decisively the discussion, because 1.4 billion people are not at the table for finance right now, and they need to be. So my first recommendation is the G21. I love the G20. Add one seat, 1.4 billion people with the AU represented.
So his first recommendation is for the G20 to accept a G21 member, of which would be an African representative. Now, this is all very well, and he got applause. He also has some other recommendations, but these recommendations were more geared towards those outside Africa and their position toward Africa. The solutions I'm hoping for, the recommendations I'm hoping for, should be things that are in the control of African leaders like Ibrahim Traoré. And in a different presentation, he outlines these more proactive African steps that we as Africans should probably listen to.
I want to leave one message, and that is that Africa's growth prospects for the next 40 years are extremely strong. Africa could achieve during the next 40-year period essentially what China achieved during the period from 1980 to 2020. China, as you know, achieved economic growth averaging around 10% per year economic growth. Phenomenal. When anything grows at 10% per period or per year, it means that it doubles in 7 years. And China went from being a low-income country to a high-income country in a period of just over 40 years. My view is that this is possible for Africa, and that this should be the aim, so that African poverty will be a thing of the past, and Africa will be solidly a middle-income region of the world, and many parts of Africa high income in the world by 2063. Economic development is a very high return activity if you do it right, and if you're lucky to avoid wars and calamities. So you have to stay peaceful. This is critical. And if the neighbors are getting along with each other, this is critical, because economic development depends on a peaceful region, in this case, a peaceful African continent, and an African continent that is in good relations with other parts of the world. That is for sure. But if that geopolitical environment can be achieved, and why not, then the economic side of the story is rather favorable. And the reason it's favorable is that if you do what I do for a living, which is Excel spreadsheets basically, and ask what are reasonable scenarios based on economic modeling and economic history for the kind of growth that can be achieved, what you find is that the returns to economic development of a poor region are just about the highest returns on investment of anything in the world. What's the real difference between the United States and Ethiopia in economic basis? The education of the population, which averages right now about 15 years of average education, because in past history, people finished high school. And now, of course, 40% finish tertiary education. So it's about 16 years as of now, average years of education. When I was a kid, I grew up in Detroit. Detroit was the motor city where all the automobiles were produced. So Detroit made sure politically that we built highways everywhere in the United States. And that was thousands and thousands of miles of highway that linked a continent at full scale. Ethiopia doesn't have that, and Africa doesn't have that. Right now, the physical connectivity in Africa is very low. It's low in all regards. It's low in paved roads, it's low in highways, it's low in power grid, it's low in fiber. But none of that is fundamental that can't be overcome. All of it is actually, in its way, rather straightforward. The investments that are needed to overcome the current liabilities, poor infrastructure, poor connectivity, not enough rail, and so forth, is not that expensive when you think about the returns that will come from that investment.
So the first thing is that we have to be peaceful in the continent of Africa. We can't be fighting each other. Tribal wars, inter-country wars, and we see that a lot at the moment. We've got Congo entering into some conflict situation. It always seems to be a turbulent place. You've got South Sudan and one or two other pockets and issues. I don't know exactly how we can do it, but maybe it's for some leaders to do it as an example. And as they begin to prosper domestically, people will start to wake up so that we can prosper in the whole continent as a whole. The second thing was education. The next thing was infrastructure. And the good thing about infrastructure is getting cheaper. For example, he spoke about power and he spoke about fiber. Well, we're moving to a world where things like solar panels are becoming so affordable, and internet can now be done via satellite, which doesn't mean you've got to lay lots of wire and fiber. So all of these things start working in our favor. The next thing he said was finance. Now, these things all work together symbiotically. If we have peace and there's an opportunity for investors to see a return on investment, then finance can come in, and we have to attract finance. Now, this is where the neo-colonialist ideas start coming in, because you have Russia investing, you have the Middle East investing, you have China investing. So it's up to the leaders to negotiate non-predatory investments. This could mean pitching different opportunities against each other. Saying to the Chinese, well, this is what the Middle East is offering. Saying to the Middle East, this is what the Russians are offering. But of course, all of this doesn't work if there is corruption. And so I don't pretend that this can be overcome overnight. But like I said, there are leaders that are leading by example. That, I think, is why Ibrahim Traoré is the most popular guy in Africa right now. And it's also why there is a bounty on his head, because he is moving forward in a manner that seems like it's not corrupt. We're talking about 50 hospitals, new roads, plants and factories that allow their people to process their minerals and their foods without having to sell them as raw materials into the global market. Also, the concept of getting knowledge into the country, getting the professionals to come in, help build infrastructural projects, schooling projects, whatever they might be, but then making sure that expertise is passed on to the people on ground, so that the next project can be done in-house, feeding the people themselves. Let us not get embroiled in what the media says about one leader or another. Let us get our act together, become uncorruptible, become united as a continent, and start to make deals for our favor as a group of people. Because as our neighbor wins, we win as well. I'm sure you guys have got your opinions, which you can put in the comments. But if you don't have an opinion to write in the comments, would it be too much for me to ask for you to write the words Unite Africa in the comment section? It lets me know that you like the content, you like the channel, and you want me to keep going. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.